Now, while I like diversification matrices as a way to plot out your various businesses and to get a sense of their relative strengths and weaknesses in their position, I don't necessarily recommend following these recommendations that come out of the matrix, the harvest, hold, and build. And the reason for that is what's missing from that decision is the notion that these businesses might actually complement one another in some way, that there is some value in holding one of the businesses to the other business. By being in business A, I can perform better in business B. And going back to my point a few minutes ago, this is the main reason why you'd want to diversify, because the value of the whole of holding those pieces is greater than the sum of the individual businesses. So what are some good reasons to diversify, to be holding such a portfolio? Well, we can think of three general classes of reasons: financial, operational, and strategic. So let me walk through each. Let's start with financial. Two main arguments for why firms should diversify for purely financial reasons. One is that perhaps it creates an opportunity to capitalize in unrelated markets. In other words, if I have a profitable business in business A, in industry A, I can use the retained earnings from that business to invest in other potentially profitable businesses. This is in essence the logic that conglomerates used in the 1970s. Keep building those businesses, use the retained earnings to invest in other profitable locations. The challenge, and really the critique of this logic, is that shareholders can do this just as well themselves. Why is it that the firm should be making these investment choices? Why not return the money, the retained earnings, the earnings, back to the shareholders and allow them to decide how they want to invest their money? So this argument about finding new opportunities to invest purely in and of themselves is largely fallen out of favor now as an argument for why to diversify. A related argument could be that firms have actually privileged information, but in essence can see profitable opportunities that capital markets otherwise do not see, that they have better foresight into where profitable opportunities to invest are. This argument as well has been strongly critiqued, basically because there is limited empirical evidence that this type of, what we might call an internal capital market here, is more efficient than the external capital market. Once again, there's no evidence that firms are better about picking winners and losers than the broader capital markets and investors are. So not to put too fine of a point on it, but these arguments here for why to diversify have fallen out of favor and are not the best arguments for why to diversify. How about another financial reason? Well, one might be to reduce the risk by diversifying your assets. For many different businesses, you might have volatility in your earnings, and this is a way to reduce that volatility in your earnings by diversifying. You think about a company like Disney. One of their large income streams comes from movies. Movies can be successful, they can be blockbusters, but they can also have failures as well. And that has a big impact on the stability of their earnings over time. So perhaps by diversifying into other businesses like theme parks and the like, they can smooth those earnings over time. The critique here is similar to before. Why is it the responsibility for the firm to do this? Why not allow your shareholders to diversify the earnings themselves? They can make assessments about the risks of certain investments and allow them to make the decision of how they'd like to diversify. Why should that be the responsibility of the business? The counter usually is our second argument here, which is to say, well, reducing volatility of earnings might actually reduce our actual employment and financial costs here. Our costs of capital and also our costs of, for example, trying to incentivize employees in the firm here. And in part, it's by reducing the risk of bankruptcy. So if you have employees who receive stock options or other incentive-based compensation, by diversifying your earnings and lowering that volatility, you may in fact be able to pay those employees more competitively than you would otherwise. The critique here is that it's not exactly clear that by holding multiple businesses, you can actually reduce your risk or reduce that volatility. In fact, in some large diversified companies, there's an increased risk or an increased volatility that might occur because of spillover effects that could happen from one business unit to another. As examples, if you have one business unit that has some type of environmental liability that leads to a lawsuit, the bounds on that lawsuit are not limited to just that business unit. Those will now go after the entire organization and could spill over to other unrelated businesses. Disney experienced this back in the late 1990s when Ellen DeGeneres, who had a television show on ABC, a division of Disney, came out that she was a homosexual. At the time, there were some who felt that this was inappropriate and they did not like that ABC and hence Disney was showing this type of show. They ended up protesting, but they didn't protest ABC. They protested Disney. They protested Disney at their theme parks. They protested Disney in terms of all of their products and services. So in this way, a risk in one business unit spilled over to all the business units of Disney. So once again, these types of arguments about reducing risk, lowering volatility, have really been frowned upon as an argument for why to diversify. So let's talk about a couple now that are more accepted now as reasons to diversify. First, operational reasons to diversify. These fall under a large bucket of things that we sometimes call synergies. Whenever you see a CEO moving into a new business or perhaps acquiring another business in a related industry, they'll use the term synergies to explain why they're motivated to pursue such an action. And these, in fact, can be legitimate reasons for pursuing diversification. First and foremost, there might just simply be economies of scale or scope. Economies of scale we typically think of in terms of the size of production in a given business. Scope refers to economies and cost savings that might occur by being in multiple businesses. The simplest way, this might be eliminating duplicate effort. So if you have two businesses, they both have their own financial and accounting groups there to service them. If you combine the two, you might be able to reduce that overhead cost through that combination. The second reason or second argument for why there might be operational reasons to diversify is that you might be able to leverage capabilities and rent-producing assets across the multiple businesses. A classic case of this is Honda Motor Company. Honda has an expertise and capability in small energy-efficient engines. They've leveraged that capability to obviously successfully enter the automobile market, but they also play in motorcycles, in lawnmowers, in watercraft, any number of motorized vehicles and tools that Honda has entered into leveraging that core technology. This is sometimes referred to as extending a core competency that you have across multiple businesses in multiple industries. Third thing you might think about is simply improving coordination among businesses. This is especially the case when we think about issues of vertical integration, where we are in multiple businesses but all in the same value chain, perhaps moving up the supply chain in terms of the businesses that we are involved in. By bringing them under the same house, within the same firm, we increase the incentive compatibility between the different entities here, perhaps create greater cooperation and information exchange, and allowing for, once again, these synergies to be realized within the organization. Now, there are some cautions here, not as far as critiques as I had in the last few slides about financial reasons. So these are just cautions that you should be aware of. One, synergies can be hard to realize in practice. Once again, whenever we have one of these diversification moves, the synergy term is thrown out. Try to be critical of that statement. Is there really synergies? Are there really synergies to be realized in this diversification move? Question whether you need to actually move into those businesses yourself, or are there other mechanisms for achieving the benefits you're seeking without full integration? Joint ventures come to mind. Is there a way to maybe move into another industry by having a relationship with an existing player in that industry without you yourself putting assets into that business? The third set of things we want to think about are strategic reasons to diversify. By strategic here, I mean competitive reasons, ways in which it allows you to jockey for position vis-a-vis your rivals. So one potential reason, strategic reason to diversify, is that you might be able to leverage your position in one market to successfully subsidize competition in another market here. Imagine you have a highly profitable business in industry A. The profits from that can be used then to feed into your competition and your efforts in industry B. This can work in some instances here, but be aware that there are instances where this might actually be an antitrust violation. In a previous lecture, I mentioned Microsoft and their efforts with Internet Explorer and Netscape. One of the things that happened in that case is Microsoft got in trouble for basically giving away Internet Explorer for free. What they had done, some would argue, is they had taken their position in operating system And they had leveraged the monies made in their operating systems to subsidize the provision of Internet Explorer for, in essence, free to the marketplace for browsers there. Second thing you'd like to think about is, are there ways in which you can raise your rivals' costs by strategically diversifying? In particular, there's an idea of vertical foreclosure. This is particularly the case in cases of vertical integration here. By moving either up or back in the supply chain or the value chain, can you basically prevent your rivals from getting access to critical assets that they need? So perhaps it's forward integrating into distribution in a way that your rivals will have difficulty penetrating the market. In one classic attempt at this, Barnes & Noble, when faced with a competitive threat of Amazon back in the early days of Amazon, tried to acquire a wholesale book publisher called Ingram. At the time, Amazon was sourcing almost all of their books through Ingram as a wholesaler there. So by Barnes & Noble acquiring them, they would have been able to prevent Amazon from getting access to their supply. Now, for this to work, the acquired entity has to have a near monopoly position, either in the upstream or downstream here. Otherwise, it will have little impact on the ability of your rivals to get access to the resources that they need. In the case of Ingram, that fell apart for a number of reasons, but one was concerns expressed in terms of antitrust as well. A third consideration is you could actually reduce rivalry through being positioned in multiple markets through a process we sometimes refer to as mutual forbearance. In the public policy realm, this is sometimes called mutually assured destruction. So during the height of the Cold War, the notion was the larger the nuclear arsenals of the Soviet Union and the US, the greater the penalties for them to engage into a fight, and it actually reduces the incentives for war at the end of the day. Similar idea taken to a business context here is that if we compete in multiple markets with our main rivals, the incentives to fight are reduced because the penalties are so high that if we engage in a price war in one market, we'll end up in a price war in another market, and then the costs to that will be much, much higher. Cautions here are that the complexity of these tacit collusion, as we've talked about before, can often be quite difficult to actually achieve in practice. And if in fact a price war does break out, these tend to be very severe as we have multiple markets now impacted by these activities. Where we've probably seen this most recently is in the media business here, where players, especially those who have downstream cable operations like Time Warner, have used those to try to negotiate better positions with companies like Disney in terms of their content that they provide. So you get a greater degree of interaction. And some would argue that Disney should try to acquire a downstream cable property or some distribution channel directed to customers to try to create this mutual forbearance. The fourth and final strategic reason we want to consider is to minimize transaction costs. So the idea of transaction costs has a rich history in economics. In fact, it's a specialty of economics called transaction cost economics. And the idea is that it's often costly, if not impossible, to write a complete contract. By this we mean when you are partnering with other economic entities here, there are going to be unforeseen contingencies that arise that you fail to write into a contract. And that leads to what we call the hold-up problem, where one partner might be able to leverage those unforeseen contingencies to their advantage in that economic relationship. Now, of course, the caution here is this assumes that trust is difficult in market exchange and that it might be undermined by these opportunistic opportunities that are presented to your various trading partners.